Thank you so much for being with us here on Atlanta News First Plus. I'm Joy Lim Nakrin, joined today by anchor Rick Fulbaum, as we are remembering the life and the legacy of former President Jimmy Carter, Georgia's own, a Plains, Georgia native, who passed away yesterday at the age of 100, Rick. An amazing life lived.
Really an amazing life. I mean, this is a man who rose from the peanut farms of Plains, Georgia, to the highest office in the land. And even though he only served one term in the White House, his legacy is so filled because of the amount of service that he continued to provide for decades after leaving office, really becoming a humanitarian, a peacemaker, a disease eradicator, and so many other things. So really just, again, a life well lived, 100 years old, and we are remembering him today as tributes continue to pour in from folks here in Georgia and from the country and from around the world.
Yeah, and truly an American hero in every sense of the word, a veteran, a beloved family man. His romance of decades with his late wife, Rosalind, really a testament to the heart of this man, so beloved by us here in Georgia. And, it's always very remarkable to people in Plains that, even though he did, like you say, rise from the peanut farm to the office of the presidency, the White House, he always wanted to go back home. And that's what he did. He passed away at his home, in his hometown, where he spent, the last decades of his life really committed to serving the community, led Sunday school at his hometown church, Maranatha Baptist Church, and continued to lead his community even after holding office both in the state and also in the White House as well. So really an incredible legacy and such a tremendous loss. But at the same time, he lived about as wonderful a life as someone could live and pass away peacefully at the age of 100 with his loved ones.
That's right. I mean, this is a somber event, but it's not a tragic event. We're talking about someone who lived to be 100 years old, and not many of us will get the opportunity to do that in our lifetimes. But you're right. I mean, and to pull the curtain back a little bit on journalism and what we do here, we prepare for the death of notable people way before they actually do pass away. That is so that we're ready when the time comes to be able to pay proper respects and take a look back at the legacy of people like former President Jimmy Carter. And so at 100 years old, we've been preparing for this day for many years, actually, not knowing, of course, when it would come. But now that it's here, we remember all of the stories that we've read preparing for this moment, stories about his life before he got into politics, before he became a state senator here in Georgia, working at the Georgia State Capitol, and then serving one term as governor of Georgia, before eventually running for the White House and winning the Democratic nomination in 1976 and the election that year and taking office in 1977. He served as President of the United States until 1981 after his defeat at the hands of Ronald Reagan. Reagan came in after one term, and we could take a look back at some of the events that happened during the Carter presidency and sort of see why he only lasted one term as opposed to being reelected for a second term. The country was going through some very difficult times, but he stayed true to his beliefs and to his convictions. He came into office after years of a lot of political dysfunction in this country, the Vietnam War, of course, which was so divisive, and then the Watergate scandal in the early 70s, culminating in President Nixon's resignation in 1974. Gerald Ford came in and became president after that as the vice president, and it was President Ford who Jimmy Carter beat in order to win the White House, and he won the White House in, I think, no small measure because he promised to never tell a lie And that was something that was very refreshing to Americans back at a time when so many Americans were jaded and skeptical with the state of politics here in this country.
No, absolutely. And by all accounts, it's his faith has been a big part of his life and his life of service, his commitment to service. Our Tracy Hutchins has a closer look at his life and legacy.
James Earl Carter Jr. was born October 1st, 1924 in Plains, Georgia, the son of a peanut farmer, James Carter Sr., known as Earl, and a nurse known by friends and family as Miss Lillian. With both parents a strong and nurturing force in his life, Jimmy Carter was a well-mannered boy and an exceptional student. From the time he was 4 years old, Carter grew up on his peanut farm, 2.5 miles west of downtown Plains. It was a life of hard work, a life Carter said he always cherished in his 1976 campaign film.
Everybody in the family loved each other. We had to work together. We didn't recognize hardships. We thought we were having a great life, and I think we probably were.
In 1941, he became the first person from his father's side of the family to graduate high school. He was accepted to the United States Naval Academy, from where he graduated in the top 10% of his class. And it was during his college years that he reconnected with an old friend back home, Rosalind Smith.
That's Rosalind standing out in front of the house.
Lifelong family friend Aline Haugebuck grew up with Rosalind and remembers when Carter asked her out to go see a movie.
And they started dating and didn't date long before they were engaged.
In 1946, the year Carter graduated from the Naval Academy, Jimmy and Rosalind were married. By that point, the future president was on track for a long, successful career in the Navy, serving at military bases from Hawaii to Connecticut. But everything changed when he lost his father to pancreatic cancer in 1953.
Well, it caused him to come back to Plains and try to, I guess, fill his father's his shoes.
My children will be the sixth generation.
Carter had 3 sons and felt he had no choice but to move his family back to Georgia and kept the peanut farm alive. He did, and not long after began dipping his toes in the pool of local politics. In 1955, Carter ran for and was elected to the Sumter County School Board.
I think he was very concerned about the plight of the schools here in our county. Of course, back then it was a segregated system. The schools for the blacks was just more or less ignored, I guess you would say, and Jimmy has always felt like things like that were not right.
After 7 years of helping build and consolidate Sumter County schools, Carter was ready for more. In 1962, he ran for state senate and won, serving 2 terms.
He felt an obligation to serve the people of Plains, of Sumter County, of Georgia.
By 1966, Carter was ready to assert himself in the race for governor, but his anti-segregationist views did not go over well with white voters, and he finished a distant third. 4 years later, Carter tried again and won, defeating Carl Sanders. Presidential historian Dr. Stephen Hockman believes Carter distinguished himself as a governor by working to strengthen the state's education system, cut government spending, and open the door to minorities.
When he gave his inaugural address, he announced to the people of Georgia the time for discrimination is over. As governor, he appointed more women and minorities than all governors of Georgia previously had appointed.
At the time, state law allowed him to serve only 1 term, and before that term was up, Carter developed a strategy for how he might become a viable presidential candidate. In the wake of the Watergate scandal, Carter painted himself as the Washington outsider, a candidate of integrity.
I'll never tell a lie. I'll never make a misleading statement.
He appealed to the American people as someone who you could be proud of.
I'll never betray the confidence that any of you has in me.
His message resonated with voters who were ready for a change from the Nixon-Ford era. And on November 2nd, 1976, Carter defeated then-President Gerald Ford.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I would look at the map of the United States sometime when he was becoming president and pinpoint Plains and think of all the places in this United States. This is where the president is coming from, this little tiny town.
The first and still only president from the state of Georgia capped off the day by walking in the inauguration parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, something never before seen from a president following an inauguration.
Comprehensive legislation.
After he took office, Carter recognized the nation was facing an energy crisis.
The amount of energy being wasted, which could be saved, is greater than the total energy that we are importing from foreign countries.
One of his signature accomplishments, the creation of the Department of Energy and also the Department of Education. And he helped broker a monumental peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, ending a 30-year-long war.
So proud of both of you. God bless you.
But Carter's accomplishments were largely overshadowed by problems at home and abroad. Inflation was a problem before he took office, and it grew worse during his tenure.
Americans did not like inflation. That was part of what hurt him politically.
A nationwide shortage in gas, which also preceded Carter's presidency, resurfaced during his time in the White House and adversely affected the lives of Americans everywhere. And on the international front, key U.S. relations with powerful nations were in trouble. In 1976, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. President Carter sharply criticized the move, and tensions between the U.S. and USSR elevated. Carter called on the U.S. Olympic Committee to boycott the 1980 Summer Games in Moscow. Many athletes were furious with the president, while several of the United States' prominent allies did not join in that boycott. Meanwhile, at the same time, in Iran, 52 American citizens. James Earl Carter Jr. was born October 1st, 1924 in Plains, Georgia, the son of a peanut farmer, James Carter Sr., known as Earl, and a nurse known by friends and family as Miss Lillian. With both parents a strong and nurturing force in his life, Jimmy Carter was a well-mannered boy and an exceptional student. From the time he was 4 years old, Carter grew up on his peanut farm, 2.5 miles west of downtown Plains. It was a life of hard work, a life Carter said he always cherished in his 1976 campaign film.
Everybody in the family loved each other. We had to work together. We didn't recognize hardships. We thought we were having a great life, and I think we probably were.
And, you know, our Sarah Hamlin is live in Plains, Georgia, this month. Obviously, it's you know, such a heartfelt loss, a bittersweet day, and a very simple day, but a lot of fond memories of this tremendous man.
It definitely is. You know, it's been quiet this morning in Plains, but, you know, businesses on Main Street here are starting to open up. There's no large scale memorial yet, but we did see a store owner placing white bows on the storefronts here on Main Street. And you know, I just talked to this man who tells me that, you know, President Carter was the first president he was able to vote for. And this man grew up about 15 miles outside of Plains, so he really said he felt such a kinship with President Carter. And so he had always said that when the day came that President Carter died, he wanted to be here in Plains, whether it meant just sitting on a bench, just being, you know, in the place where he grew up. And that's exactly where we found him, on a bench, just reminiscing about, you know, President Carter's legacy. And he told us that, you know, he actually met or saw President Carter twice. Once here, while he was having lunch at one of the diners here, he saw all the Secret Service and saw President Carter walk in and shake the hands of everybody in there and greet everyone. And then he saw him again at an airport out west, the same thing. He saw him shake everyone's hand to greet them and say hello. So it just really drives home the point of how loved and respected President Carter is and was here in Plains. And you can't go very far here in Plains without seeing his name on a plaque or a building. His childhood farm is just down the road from where we are. His campaign headquarters is right across the street from us in the old train depot. There's a sign here in downtown on Main Street that proudly states that Plains is home to Georgia's only president. And again, this man that I spoke to says, he hopes one day again he'll get the chance to vote for a president from Georgia. But I know we've gone through his extensive legacy and resume here, but just to take it back, former President Jimmy Carter and his late wife, former First Lady Rosalind Carter, they are beloved here. He started as a peanut farmer here in Plains before his political career took him to the White House. He ran for state senate in the 60s, ran for governor. He lost the first time and he won in an easy victory in the 1970s. And then that's when he announced he would run for president, and he beat the incumbent Gerald R. Ford in a narrow margin, returned to Plains after one term, and he's been here ever since. So it's safe to say he is very beloved here in Plains, and his name and his legacy is here everywhere you look.
Absolutely, Sarah. And I understand you spoke with one man who I believe is a native of Plains, Georgia himself, and kind of speaks to the sentiment in the hometown of Jimmy Carter, how deeply he will be missed and how fondly he'll be remembered.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I think that's a sentiment that so many people share. And this man, he also spoke to the fact, and it's something, I'm from Georgia originally. I grew up in Macon. It's something I've heard all my life. And he echoed the sentiment of whether you agreed with President Carter politically. I've never heard someone, and he's never heard someone speak a cross word about President Carter as a person, as a man. And he says that that's something that, has echoed throughout everywhere he's been. People, say he was just such a respected man and a person with his humanitarian work and the legacy that, he left once he left office and started doing so much work with Habitat for Humanity and all the organizations that he was a part of. So that's definitely a sentiment shared on, like you guys have said, a somber day here in Plains.
Any final thoughts, observations about the mood there? Obviously, it's a quiet time everywhere because it's between the holidays and we're about to start the new year, and it's still fairly early in the morning. Things are getting going there, but would you say that it is a somber mood overall in Plains?
It is. There's a sense of, wanting to celebrate his life and his legacy. But, we spoke to the person who was putting the white ribbons on the storefronts down here on Main Street. And he said, they're kind of taking a moment to kind of have that as a private moment amongst people who, are from here, who know him well and who know his legacy well. It's sort of almost like a very close family here in Plains. They want to take the time to sort of grieve and celebrate the life and the legacy here.
Yeah, and it's 100 years is a great life, but very hard to say goodbye. It really is. Well, thank you so much, Sarah Hammond, reporting live in Plains. And I want to bring back in my co-anchor, Rick Falbaum, joining us. And Rick, I know you've covered the late President Jimmy Carter for many years, and have followed his life, in politics, and also his personal life, his life as a humanitarian, and he's just such a multi-dimensional human being that really gave back in almost every aspect of his life.
Well, I think there's a common thread here, starting before he took public office, became a state senator, until the very end of his life, and that is his faith, which really was the driving force. We talk about white evangelicals in this day and age, though white evangelicals in this country are more closely aligned with the Republican Party, but here is a Democrat who wore his faith on his sleeve, spoke openly about it at a time when not a lot of politicians were doing that. But I really do think that he, took the words of scriptures and the Gospels to heart, and used that as a guide as he carried out his life both in public and in private. Really setting an example both in his actions and his deeds and in his marriage. We talk about Rosalind Carter and their 77 years together, the vows that they took, so long ago. And he said that was the smartest decision he ever made, was marrying Rosalind. And I think it was the strength of their bond, that really helped to carry him through what were some pretty difficult times. And it's been reported that after President Carter lost his reelection bid in 1976, that it was a loss that Rosalind Carter did not take very well. It was really, really hard on her, but the couple came back to Georgia and very quickly rededicated themselves to this idea of serving others. And that is something that I think will be a lasting legacy, something that we'll be talking about, of course, in the days and weeks to come. And you can go back and look at his presidency. Like we said, he only served one term. It was a very tough time in our country. There was very high inflation. There was an energy crisis that was the result of an oil embargo on the part of Arab states. And of course, there was a hostage crisis involving Iran when Americans were taken hostage at the U.S. Embassy in Iran. President Carter tried to rescue them. It was a failed mission that resulted in the death of 8 U.S. service members, and that was something that, really, really was very, very damaging to the president's standing in his public opinion here in the United States. And then for him to have to run for re-election at a time when those hostages were still being held, and they were held for over a year, 444 days. And he worked so hard to try to negotiate their release, only to see them released on the day that Ronald Reagan was sworn in as his successor. And so that, I think, a lot of people will look back at the 4 years that Jimmy Carter spent in the White House and say, well, gee, this was not a president who really was able to achieve very much and who was able to lead the country, through peace and prosperity. That was not what Jimmy Carter inherited when he took office in 1977. It was a very difficult 4 years for him, and like we said, it led to him being turned away from a re-election bid. But it's the years that he spent after that, the decades that he spent after leaving the White House, that I think are going to get the most attention in the days and weeks ahead.
Right, absolutely, and making that return to his hometown of Plains, Georgia, a rural community, where he had his roots, as a peanut farmer, and leading Sunday school services late into his life at Maranatha Baptist Church, which is his home church, and his work with Habitat for Humanity and beyond. At age 100, he became the oldest living U.S. president, and again, the only president or former president from the state of Georgia. Ivan Rodriguez has a closer look back at his life.
From a small-town Georgia peanut farmer to President of the United States, Jimmy Carter aspired to make government competent and compassionate.
Our social and political progress has been based on one fundamental principle: the value and importance of the individual.
After 7 years as a naval officer, he returned home to Plains, Georgia, before entering into politics, eventually being elected governor of Georgia, using the platform to speak out against racism.
I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
Becoming president in 1977, his achievements were notable, including the Camp David Peace Accords in 1978, the framework for peace between Israel and Egypt. But there were dark days too, including the Iran hostage crisis that, together with the continuing inflation at home and an energy shortage contributed to Ronald Reagan's landslide victory in 1980. Jimmy and his wife Rosalind founded the Carter Center in 1982, promoting peace, democracy, human rights, and economic and social development all over the world. In 2002, his work earned him the Nobel Peace Prize. A devout Christian, his life was largely defined by his faith and service to others. He spent decades teaching Sunday school in the small town where he was raised and volunteering with Habitat for Humanity. The longest-lived president in American history. I love you! Leaves behind a legacy of love. Married 77 years before his beloved Rosalind's passing in November 2023, calling their marriage the pinnacle of his life.
Well, the best thing I ever did was marrying Rosalind.
In Plains, Georgia, I'm Ivan Rodriguez.
And Ivan Rodriguez with that look back at the life of the late President Jimmy Carter. And obviously so much impact here around the state of Georgia. And you know, the mark of any famous Georgia Democrat is spending time.
And it says, to my good friend Manny Maloof, Jimmy Carter.
At Manuel's Tavern. And on North Highland Avenue in Atlanta. And Atlanta News First Madeline Montgomery has a little more on how the politically powerful owner had a deep respect for Mr. Carter.
And it says, to my good friend Manny Maloof, Jimmy Carter.
Before he made it to the White House, James Earl Carter Jr., better known as Jimmy Carter, announced he'd run as Georgia's governor right here at Manuel's Tavern.
He just was really interlinked with us and with Manuel.
Manuel's Tavern started as a neighborhood bar in the 1950s, run by Manuel Maloof, known as the godfather of Georgia Democratic politics. The Carters would become regulars, especially after the Carter Center opened less than half a mile from the tavern.
He would come in and shake everyone's hand, and I have a photo of him with my daughter. When he saw my daughter, he stopped to spend extra time with her.
General Manager Stephen Pitts says he'll miss seeing Jimmy's surprise patrons at trivia night, but is glad he's reunited with his wife, Rosalind Carter, who died a little over a year ago.
She was his true lifelong partner. They were so tight and so close.
And they'll never leave these historic walls.
All of his accomplishments, including maybe especially post-presidency, should make every Georgian proud.
Madeline Montgomery, Atlanta News First.
And I'd like to bring in now my colleague, Atlanta News First reporter Asia Wilson. And Asia, obviously, so many remembrances pouring in, tributes pouring in for the late President Jimmy Carter. And you're at the Carter Center, where we see a growing memorial there.
You're exactly right, Joy. It's been that way since yesterday when it was announced that he passed away. And even today, we're starting to see daylight here. When we started to see daylight here, we started to see more and more people going. You can actually see someone there now. We spoke with a woman earlier, not long ago, who said that she woke up this morning and she had to really think to herself, and she actually asked herself, how am I going to deal with this day, because she really, really admired him. And that's kind of been the similar story from so many people that we spoke with yesterday and today. They've said that he's really had an impact on their life. That woman, she actually lives a couple of neighborhoods over, and she talked about how some of the homes in her neighborhood are Habitat for Humanity homes. And she said that the former president had a hand in building some of those. So she said that seeing those homes and waking up to that is kind of like a living memorial right there in her neighborhood.
Yeah, and incredible, and we know how dedicated Mr. Carter was in his work with Habitat for Humanity. So certainly has to mean so much to the woman you spoke of and to the community. Any other observations as you're there at the Carter Center, where Mr. Carter and Mrs. Carter's work, outside of public office, extended really until the end of their lives?
Well, just a moment ago, we saw what appeared to be a woman and a small child, come up holding each other, embracing each other with flowers in hand, and then you can see them putting it down on the ground. But then you also see that small child kind of just take a picture. You can see the adult taking the picture in front of the sign of that child. So, of course, it's impacting not only people who were alive who were alive when he was president, but then also small children who are just hearing about this as well. So certainly this is impacting so many others. But also the woman that we spoke with earlier, she spoke about, the president. And I asked her, what is one thing that you're going to remember most about President Jimmy Carter? And she said his love for his wife and just seeing them over the years. Me personally, I started out in Southwest Georgia where I was in Plains. I was able to see him in person and just saw how loving he was, but also how he interacted not only with us, the media, but he actually took the time to shake people's hand. And that was something people admired in that community. But then also spent some time at the Boys and Girls Club in Southwest Georgia as well. And there he was, him and former First Lady were there front and center supporting some of those causes and some of those fundraisers. So he supported the children, he supported the Boys and Girls Club, Habitat for Humanity, and so many other things as well.
All right, Asia Wilson reporting live from the Carter Center, and I want to bring in now anchor Rick Fulbaum. You, of course, have spent so many years covering the late President Jimmy Carter, and 100 years, that's an incredible life, and not just in terms of the length of his life, but what he's given back, how he's going to be remembered, not just for his time in the presidency, in the White House, and also as a Georgia governor, but as a family man, a humanitarian who dedicated his life to loving others and to helping others.
Yeah, listening to Asia talk about her experiences covering him as a reporter in South Georgia, and seeing him hands-on. He not only talked the talk, he walked the walk, to use the cliche. I mean, he really did get his hands dirty. He didn't just go around telling other people what to do. He was right there front and center doing it himself. And I think that is a big part of his legacy. You think about these images of home buildings with Habitat for Humanity, and you think of Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter with tools in their hands. I mean, actually at work building these homes. And it was something that they did every single year, and they did it until very recently. I mean, well into their 90s, this couple was still at it, committing themselves to the idea of providing homes for people who needed it. I remember seeing him even after he had had a fall and had a bruise on his face.
Yes.
And he was still out there with the black eye, doing the work for Habitat for Humanity. And I think that's another thing that I think that people are going to be focusing on and paying attention to, or at least I hope they will in the days to come, and that is the fact that President Carter did not shy away from the spotlight, did not shy away from the cameras and public life, even as he aged, and at a time when a lot of public figures, understandably, sort of keep to themselves and keep away from public view as they get older, and as age begins to take its toll, as it does on all of us. Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter had no problem being seen publicly, even as they aged and even as they dealt with their infirmities. And I think that is also a lesson in aging, that I think a lot of people could listen to. And when we heard almost 2 years ago that he had decided to forego any more traditional medical treatments after a couple of short stays at the hospital, and the Carter Center announcing that he would be returning home to receive at-home hospice care. I think that was the beginning of a conversation that a lot of families began to have, and that is end-of-life decisions, and how those decisions, can be made at a time before there's a crisis, when someone can decide, to go out on his or her own terms, and palliative care and end-of-life care is something that a lot of us, that all of us will have to face at some point in time or another. And the fact that he faced it so publicly and announced his decisions, so that we could all know what he was doing and maybe have those conversations within our own families.
I know that
I think is a very important part of his legacy.
It's so true, and it, in a way, was yet another act of service. You know, we saw how Mr. and Mrs. Carter spent their lives really destigmatizing things like mental illness, poverty, in their work for Habitat for Humanity, and now aging, and frankly death, because, you know, we're all going to make the transition, and, you know, they showed us how to live, and frankly how to die, you know, with dignity and surrounded by loved ones.
That's right. You know, I think that as we talk about his life, we will all, and how he lived it, we'll also talk about the end of his life and how he lived that and how he lived it. The word dignity that you just used is so apt here, because I think that you know, that was really front and center. You know, and I think that as we listen to these tributes come in from President Biden and from other major political leaders here in this country, former presidents and others, we also heard a very warm statement from President-elect Trump, you know, who of course doesn't really share a lot of the same politics as President Carter. They were on opposite sides of many of the issues of the day, and yet Jimmy Carter was someone who really transcended politics after leaving office. He wasn't thought of as a particularly partisan politician, even though, of course, he was very vocal in how he felt. You can see the statement from President-elect Trump saying that Melania and I are thinking warmly of the Carter family and their loved ones during this difficult time. We urge everyone to keep them in their hearts and prayers. And at a time in our country, Joy, when there seems to be so much political division and so much fighting when it comes to the hot button issues of the day, the fact that that the mourning, the remembrances, the tributes to Jimmy Carter are bipartisan
Yes.
today is something that I think you know, is something that we can all pay attention to and be grateful for.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, we've talked a lot about how important the hometown of Plains, Georgia, has always been to Mr. and Mrs. Carter, and it is where they chose to live the remainder of their lives, even after life in the White House and Mr. Carter, you know, taking the highest office in the land. They wanted to return back to their humble roots. He wanted to return back to his humble roots as a peanut farmer, and you know, leading Sunday school services at Maranatha Baptist Church. So Plains, Georgia is a very special place for the Carter family. And likewise, the Carter family is a very special family for Plains, Georgia.
For sure. I mean, absolutely the most famous family to come out of Plains. And I think that will probably be the case for many, many years to come. You know, and you talk about this small town in South Georgia that will very soon be hosting dignitaries from around the world who will be traveling to Plains, Georgia, to pay their respects to President Carter. Of course, he's going to have a state funeral. President Biden making that announcement yesterday on January 9th. It's a national day of mourning. There will be a service for President Carter at the National Cathedral in Washington. But of course, the remembrance ceremonies will continue and be held here in Georgia as well. And I think that the town of Plains and our state are going to be in the spotlight as the world mourns former President Carter.
Very, very much so. And our colleague, anchor Sean Gables, has a closer look at that hometown of Plains, Georgia, and that community's relationship with the Carters.
It is in some ways the same now as it was 80 years ago. To stroll around downtown Plains in the 21st century is to walk virtually the same steps Jimmy Carter would have walked as a young boy. The same country roads and storefronts, the same farm on which Carter grew up, forever preserved as a National Historic Site.
This is where he lived from the age of 4.
With park rangers like Randy Dillard, helping tell the Carter family story.
In 1928, they had no electricity or running water, so you see the outhouse here in the backyard. Of course, the Carters lived off the land.
For Jimmy and his siblings, it was a life of hard work. Their father Earl and mother Lillian demanded nothing less than a full day's labor on top of excellence in school and regular attendance at church. In the evening, if they wanted chicken for dinner, they had to go out back and catch one.
Growing up, President Carter thought...
Dillard says perhaps more important than the work ethic President Carter learned on his father's peanut farm were the character traits he developed. At a time when segregation was still the rule, Carter's parents went against the grain in what they taught Jimmy.
This place was very significant in the fact that as a young child, he would help his mother take care of the African-American residents in this area. And Miss Lillian taught all of her children to take care of those people.
They were the principles Carter took with him to the governor's chair at the Capitol, where in 1971, he announced in his inaugural speech that the time for discrimination in Georgia was over. And even as he ascended to the presidency of the United States, Carter never forgot where he came from. The experience he gained while serving on the school board in Sumter County helped pave the way for his career in politics and service to the world.
It's hard for me to say how much it must mean to him. The thought that he didn't think of going anywhere else when he retired from the presidency. From what he says, he just always wanted to come back to Plains.
Friends like Elaine Haugebuk knew President Carter from their days as children. She recalls when he first asked her friend Rosalind Smith out for a date. Carter and Smith were engaged not long after. Their marriage, born in Plains.
We all knew each other from the beginning of our lives. We had to sort of pinch ourselves to realize that the Jimmy from Plains was the Jimmy in the White House.
Even she was surprised when in his later years, President Carter spent more and more time back home. He was often seen walking the streets of Plains with Rosalind.
We take for granted ability.
And he continued teaching Sunday school at his church until he was no longer able to serve. In the end, his life revolved around the town he treasured so deeply, the town that helped shape the man who would become president.
To go back to his humble beginnings, and a beautifully told story by our Sean Gables about the childhood, the humble beginnings of Mr. Carter, and that's where he wanted to spend the rest of his life, in Plains, Georgia. Remembering how he started as a peanut farmer.
And he died in a home that he and Rosalind built. Rosalind, who died last year, is buried right out on the grounds of that property, underneath a willow tree, and we've been told that President Carter will be buried right alongside her when that eventually happens over the next week or so. But yeah, I mean, that Plains, Georgia was in their blood. It's where they came from, and you talk about this couple that came together. One of the more amazing stories that has been told often is that Jimmy Carter's mother, Lillian, was a nurse and actually delivered Rosalind when she was born. It's just amazing to think that this couple would have these ties that would then lead to a marriage that would last for 77 years. It really is just a storybook tale that you really couldn't make it up if you wanted to. Just the drama of all of that, and of course it's something that also a marriage and a relationship that had to survive Jimmy Carter's military service because he of course served in the Navy and graduated from the Naval Academy. He served our country, and was actually a part of the leadership team on the first U.S. nuclear submarine. And so very, very important work. He was trained as an engineer, and he really put those skills to work for our country even before he ran for public office.
Yes, and you mentioned that important work as a naval officer on his way to run actually one of the first, I should say, nuclear submarines before he ultimately did return back to Plains, Georgia. Tracy Hutchins has a closer look at that.
Tonight I want to have an unpleasant talk with you about a problem that's unprecedented in our history.
In his first week in office, President Jimmy Carter told Americans they needed to waste less energy and reduce reliance on foreign oil.
So there was a pretty big consensus in the mid-70s when he was elected we needed to do something about energy, and he often called it the biggest challenge that he faced.
The energy crisis was at its peak.
The energy crisis has not yet overwhelmed us, but it will if we do not act quickly.
And there were a lot of ideas on how to wean the nation off its dependency on Middle East oil. Jay Hawks worked on Carter's energy policy.
Carter probably was the most fervent of the people of that era in raising the energy issue and trying to look 20, 30 years ahead.
Increasing the use of nuclear power was a controversial idea, but Carter's position on energy was visionary and largely influenced by his naval career working on nuclear submarines.
It was extremely innovative. It was extraordinarily complex, and it was dangerous.
Professor Joseph Crespino taught alongside Carter at Emory University, where Carter lectured for more than 30 years.
More than anything, it showed him that he kind of knew the situation from the inside in a way that policymakers rarely do.
As a professor, Carter was overly prepared and could recall even the lesser-known details of his presidency, characteristics Crespino says came from his military background.
The decision to return the crown of St. Stephen's to the Hungarian people. This was a controversial thing. Not only did President Carter know about it, he talked for about 10 minutes about what a important decision that was for him personally.
The son of a peanut farmer in Plains, Georgia, Carter wanted to be like his uncle, Tom Gordy, a sailor who would send him letters and trinkets from his deployments.
For him, it was a chance to see the world.
In 1952, the notoriously outspoken Admiral Hyman Rickover selected him as an engineer for his atomic submarine program. Carter said besides his father, no other person had such a profound impact on his life.
He frightened everybody that worked for him. He was very demanding. He wanted perfection.
Rickover's program was responsible for developing the world's first nuclear-powered engines.
His experience in the military would have given him, a familiarity in his role as commander-in-chief that, a lot of presidents today don't have.
There, Carter had top security clearance and worked on groundbreaking technology, exploring ways nuclear power could generate electricity and propel ships.
It was taking this technology that had been used for destructive purposes, and how could it be put to use for positive, peaceful purposes.
That same year, Carter saw firsthand the destructive nature of nuclear power when he was lowered into a damaged reactor to clean up a partial meltdown at the Chalk River Laboratories in Canada.
While in most areas of life we all allow ourselves to make occasional mistakes, if you're working on nuclear reactors, you probably don't want to make any mistakes.
That experience later informed Carter's decisions as president.
And it may be part of the reason why President Carter the United States was never involved in a war during President Carter's 4 years. And it may be that his experience with the military, that his confidence in his own decision-making and how to use the military as commander-in-chief was in part related to the fact that he had spent so much time as a naval officer.
Carter graduated from the Naval Academy in Annapolis in 1946 in the top 10% of his class and married his hometown sweetheart, Rosalind Smith. During his Navy years, the couple had 3 sons and was stationed in several states, including Hawaii, Connecticut, and California.
But he also had interesting assignments, and he was one of the last Americans in China before the communists took over. In fact, they used to take their boats and point them outward from port because if the communists came into the city, they would have to evacuate.
When his father died in 1953, Carter returned to Plains to manage the family farm and was given an honorable discharge.
You could see him, when he got back to Plains, getting more and more interested in politics.
Carter would rise from senator to governor to 39th president.
Well, I think the Navy taught him to be very disciplined about things like showing up on time, preparing. One of the things about Carter that I learned from personal experience is you don't have to write him a long memo, but he does not like to go into a meeting without having reviewed a memo laying out the principles of the meeting, even in some cases where he kind of already knows.
The only president to have actual experience cleaning up a nuclear mess. Carter made sure he had direct contact with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 1979, following the 3 Mile Island meltdown in Pennsylvania.
He puts in this hotline to the people that are on site there from the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, and he's in constant contact with them. Well, he, in some ways, knows more about it than they do.
Carter created the Department of Energy in 1977.
And today, you know, I think it plays a huge positive role in research and development, and things like developing appliance efficiency standards and things like that that Carter envisioned when he set up the department.
He pushed for renewable alternatives and even had solar panels installed on the roof of the White House. And in 1978, he postponed the development of the neutron bomb.
We sometimes look at the short-term impacts of presidents, but it takes a long time for a person or a country to build up credibility. You know, he did a lot of things that were more successful than have been recognized.
You take it.
That we had torn.
And, you know, Rick, we have talked a lot about the love between Rosalind and Jimmy Carter, and this romance that spanned literally decades. And, you know, you've also described how they will be laid to rest. Well, Mr. Carter will be laid to rest next to his late wife, you know, in their hometown on the peanut farm under a willow tree, which is, you know, it's a beautiful way to think of them living in the afterlife together, resting together after this romance that has lasted most of their lives.
Yeah, I mean, whatever your beliefs are, absolutely, it is comforting to think of them lying side by side on the grounds of the home, a property that they have donated to the U.S. Park Service. So it is part of the public
the saying
land
goes,
now.
behind every great
Let's listen.
man. The saying goes, behind every great man is a great woman. Always a step behind her husband, or more often, at Jimmy Carter's side, you would find Rosalind Carter. The couple grew up together in their small hometown of Plains, Georgia, but Rosalind didn't have a crush on Jimmy until she saw him in his naval uniform on a visit home from the academy.
I was standing on the steps of our church waiting for a youth meeting to begin. And he rode up in the car with Ruth and her boyfriend, got out and asked me to go to the movie with him. Well, of course, I left the meeting, I went to the movie. Don't ask me what it's about, I have not the slightest idea.
Well, I didn't have any idea what Rosa was going to say, but I think I came away fairly unscathed, and I'm grateful to you, sweetheart.
They kissed on that first date and married in that church in 1946, a union that would grow stronger over time and last for 73 years.
Hard work has been the driving force in Jimmy Carter's life.
After moving around the country on military assignment, the couple returned to run the family peanut farm in Plains, where they raised their 4 children. Carter was elected governor in 1970.
They're looking for a candidate they can trust. They see Jimmy and they respond to him. It's great.
6 years later, Mrs. Carter was front and center in her husband's run for the White House, campaigning alone on his behalf in 41 states. During their time as the first couple, Mrs. Carter supported her husband's work, something she did until his last day.
He's a good father, good grandfather, good great-grandfather, and I'm proud of him. I'm proud that he stands for human rights and peace all over the world.
For decades, the couple traveled the world, trying to change it for the better.
They truly live their life hoping to make somebody else's life better.
For better or for worse, their love never wavered.
An MRI showed that there was a cancer or growth, a tumor on my liver.
Shortly before announcing his cancer diagnosis, Carter published his book, A Full Life, Reflections at 90. Inside, a portrait he painted of his lifelong love, along with a dedication to her, to Rosalind, who has kept my life full of love.
Well, the best thing I ever did was marrying Rosalind. That's the pinnacle of my life. I think I've ever been as blessed as any human being in the world.
Well, we appreciate you being with us here on the First Alert Desk for our continuing coverage of former President Jimmy Carter, who died yesterday at the age of 100 years old. Not many people can say they can live to be that long, and a lot of people can't say they can make that kind of impact. I'm Brooks Baptiste.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm Gervier Denza. Since the news broke yesterday, I think this is all anybody here in Atlanta and across the world is talking about, Brooks, and you're exactly right. You know, It's a somber day because we are remembering and recognizing someone who made such a significant impact, but it's also something to celebrate. Like you said, who lives to be 100 years old? The oldest living American president.
Just think about that, Gravir, because we've been talking about former President Carter for quite some time. You know, he was coming up on 2 years of being in hospice care. And I think a lot of us wondered after former First Lady Rosalind Carter passed how long he would live after that because of their love story and because who they were together and the impact that they made together. But finally, they are reunited.
Right. You know, it's interesting because Jason Carter, we hear a lot from his
Yes.
grandson, Jason Carter, who would update us on how Mr. Carter was doing. And he talked about how he was looking forward to the election and being able to cast his vote in this election this year. And I think the last time anyone saw Mr. Carter was for his 100th
For his
birthday.
100th,
when he actually watched the big flyover in his little town of Plains, Georgia. Those people recognizing, of course, his longevity and his impact, not only in Plains, but across the world.
And take a look at this. This is Georgia's own credit union. They always put things up there on that top banner, that billboard there where you can see it as you're passing through downtown Atlanta. And of course, Mr. Jimmy Carter is there with his face, you know, really shining across the city right now. We know how important Georgia is to him, or was to him, then we know how important Atlanta was to him as well. But again, you know, the reaction has been pouring in now since that news came down just before 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. And CNN's Ivan Rodriguez has more.
To President of the United States,
I, Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter aspired to make government competent and compassionate.
Our social and political progress has been based on one fundamental principle: the value and importance of the individual.
After 7 years as a naval officer, he returned home to Plains, Georgia, before entering into politics, eventually being elected governor of Georgia, using the platform to speak out against racism.
I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
Becoming president in 1977, his achievements were notable, including the Camp David Peace Accords in 1978, the framework for peace between Israel and Egypt. But there were dark days too, including the Iran hostage crisis that, together with the continuing inflation at home and an energy shortage, contributed to Ronald Reagan's landslide victory in 1980. Jimmy and his wife Rosalind founded the Carter Center in 1982, promoting peace, democracy, human rights, and economic and social development all over the world. In 2002, his work earned him the Nobel Peace Prize. A devout Christian, his life was largely defined by his faith and service to others. He spent decades teaching Sunday school in the small town where he was raised and volunteering with Habitat for Humanity. The longest-lived president in American history.
I love you!
Leaves behind a legacy of love. Married 77 years before his beloved Rosalind's passing in November 2023, calling their marriage the pinnacle of his life.
Well, the best thing I ever did was marrying Rosalind.
In Plains, Georgia, I'm Ivan Rodriguez.
I think that's my favorite sound from him is that, you know, that was the best thing he ever did. They grew up down the street from each other.
Look,
and, you know, Plains isn't a big town. So when you're talking, what, 600 people or something?
Yes, nothing major at all.
She was, Rosalind Carter was was Jimmy Carter's sister's best friend. And so there you go.
Isn't it always funny how you meet someone,
Yes.
and we'll hear more about their love story in a bit because we're talking about we're talking about 7 decades that they were together.
Yep.
What a long time to be with that same person, but
I
that just
know.
goes to show you how much they loved each other. We talked about some of that reaction that is pouring in. Many of state and national figures were releasing statements and whatnot yesterday, so we want to begin with President Joe Biden saying America and the world have lost an extraordinary leader, statesman, and humanitarian. Over 6 decades, we had the honor of calling Jimmy Carter a dear friend. What's extraordinary about Jimmy Carter, though, is that millions of people throughout America and the world who never met him thought of him as a dear friend as well.
And we're also hearing from incoming President Donald Trump, he said, Melania and I are warmly thinking of the Carter family and their loved ones during this difficult time. We urge everyone to keep them in their hearts and prayers. The challenge Jimmy faced as president came at a pivotal time for our country, and he did everything in his power to improve the lives of all Americans. And for that, we all owe him a debt of gratitude, that coming from President-elect Donald Trump.
And we've been hearing from Governor Brian Kemp, governor of Georgia. As the only president thus far to come from Georgia, he showed the world the impact our state and its people have on the country. And as a son of Plains, he always valued Georgians and the virtues of our state, choosing to return to his rural home after his time in public office. And we've been hearing from Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens as well, who's had, I'll say this, everybody has only had the great things to say about this man, given what he's done and the impact that he's made.
Absolutely. Mayor Dickens from Atlanta said, I was born into a state led by Governor Carter. When I learned the Pledge of Allegiance at Miles Elementary School, a photo of President Carter hung on the wall. And for the last 4 decades, I've watched Jimmy Carter and his beloved Rosalind be the very definition of servant leaders representing the best that our state and our nation have to offer.
And we've heard from civil rights icon daughter, Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter, Bernice King, who says, we honor the extraordinary life and legacy of President Jimmy Carter, a global champion for peace, justice, and equality. And she went on to say President Carter was unapologetic in his faith and in how he conducted himself as an elected official. He led with integrity, compassion, and a deep commitment to serving humanity. And I love that part where she says he was unapologetic in his faith.
Yep.
Those who know or knew President Carter would always say he was serious about his faith. He didn't hide it. I mean, he was teaching Sunday school well into his 90s as well at his church, Maranatha Baptist Church. That just goes to show you just a piece of who he was.
Yeah, and there's so many of those comments as we were reading those and as I was thinking about the comments that people were making, and remembering his legacy. I was thinking about his faith. I was thinking about his love for Rosalind Carter. What Governor Kemp said, that he was a son of Plains, Georgia. He never forgot his roots. He never forgot that he was from Georgia. And you know, Brooks, when you think back at the time when he was elected president, we were coming out of Watergate, right? Because there are a lot of people, historians, who will say, oh my goodness, if it had not been for Watergate, he never would have been elected president. Nobody knew who he was. I mean, you're talking about a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, running for president of the United States. I mean, he had come home after he had been in a submarine, right? Working in a nuclear submarine. And when his father passed away, he said, you know what, I got to go home, got to take over the family business. So he comes back home to Plains, Georgia to run a peanut farm. And at some point in his life, he decides, hey, I want to give back. I got to do something more. And so he ran for the state Senate. From there, he ran for governor. Still no one knew who he was. And then in 1973, he's thinking, okay, I'm looking ahead. And Watergate had just happened, and he introduced himself to the world stage.
Isn't that something? And when you take a look at these images coming out of Plains, if we could pop those back up, I just want to show you, it's so interesting because you know that small town has changed through the years, but that town is committed to Jimmy Carter. He was committed to that town and several parts of Georgia and then our nation as well. And Gravir, you know, what's always so interesting when somebody of this magnitude passes, we start to hear some of the things that maybe we didn't know. You know, we're in different generations. This was before my time when he was in office, but I've always been impressed by some of the things that he was doing. And, you know, you just talked about this, about him serving as a submariner in the U.S. Navy. So he graduated from the Naval Academy, then he first served on the ship, and then the Carter family moved from Norfolk to Hawaii to Connecticut, New York, and California with the service. So he had been in several places before he decided to run for president. And a life well lived.
People from other parts of the country sometimes think of the South as kind of podunk, and you think a little, peanut farmer. He was a nuclear physicist, for goodness sake, in the Naval Academy. He studied nuclear physics.
Smart, and the first in his family to graduate from college.
Correct.
That, again, I think what's been very interesting is seeing how many firsts he was, for
Right.
his family. And there's something else that I learned, and I thought this was pretty cool too. He was the first U.S. president to be born in a hospital.
Right.
You're thinking, well, there was a time when it wasn't normal for people to be born in hospitals.
You know what? They did not have indoor toilet at his house. When he was growing up,
Really?
He had an outhouse. He was growing up in
Wow.
Plains, Georgia. Yes. And Brooks, I think you and I both really recognize and appreciate his deep faith.
Yeah.
Because every aspect of his life, from his marriage to his service as state senator, as governor, and then as president of the United States, and then that 40 years of service afterward, every bit of that was rooted in his faith.
And I think what's so interesting here is, Rick Folbaum actually did an incredible story that we're about to let you guys see in just a minute. But he, Mr. Carter, he died in the house that he built with his own two hands back in 1961. This is when he built this home. And he had been under hospice care. But what was so interesting is, I think up until his last days, and maybe up until those days where, he wasn't as present as he was, getting towards the end of life, he still knew who his God was.
Amen.
He still knew who
love
his
that.
God was. And one of the things, Gravere, we had this conversation. We talked about him and how he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I didn't pray and ask God for long life. I just prayed for God to make me be okay with what death is.
Correct.
And he was at peace.
He was at peace. When he was diagnosed with brain cancer, and we heard from him about that diagnosis,
Yes.
I think that people understood how deep that faith was and where his life is rooted when he basically said that. Look, man, I'm ready to go.
Because think
when
about
my
it-
time comes,
right.
I'm ready.
Because Gravere, what does the average person do when they receive a diagnosis and they learn that life may be cut short?
Correct.
Especially depending on which age you may be at. But he didn't seem to feel that way. I'm sure the biggest thing to him was, look, I got to stick around for my wife. I've got to be around for Rosalind, which I
Right.
totally understand. But he was definitely one of those that said, I'm okay with whatever God allows. And that just shows you what he is. So take a look at this story from Rick Folbaum. Really an incredible just story that's going to tell you a little bit about how religion played such a great part in his life.
That we had torn down the barriers that separated those of different race and region and religion.
When Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976, Newsweek magazine declared it the year of the evangelical. A born-again Christian, Carter's religious faith guided every aspect of his life. He evangelized foreign leaders and often said it was his faith that pushed him to fight for peace between Israel and Egypt.
What he has reminded us of is that faith is not a private matter. It is something that we live out publicly, and even though we can be committed to separation of church and state, we can still be also very committed to living out our faith publicly, out in the open, and seeking justice and peace. Because of our faith. And I think he's shown us how to do that.
That pursued charitable works.
Pastor Jeremy Schulte leads Marantha Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia, Carter's hometown, and where he taught Sunday school for more than 35 years.
Okay, I need any number up to 20.
Hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world
What's your number, sir?
would line up outside the small church to hear his ministry.
It's been an interesting experience to call him a friend and parishioner. And when you've served alongside him here in Plains, you can truly 100% say that his faith is genuine and meaningful to him personally, and that he has grown in his faith throughout the course of his life.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
Carter's rise to become the 39th president ranks as one of the most unlikely political victories in U.S. history. He was virtually unknown to the country, except for Georgia, where he served as governor. He campaigned on a promise to never tell a lie.
I think he was very committed to the concepts of honesty and fairness. Now, you can always argue about what's honest and what's fair, but I do think he had a very strong attachment to that and was willing to devote himself to those values in ways that would not always be normal in a political environment.
Not since John F. Kennedy, a Catholic, had a presidential candidate been so frank about his religious beliefs.
I'm pretty sure that was right after we won the caucuses.
Jay Hakes is a historian and former director of the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Museum Center in Atlanta.
It was a very intense thing with him, and I think it did, it was another part of what I would call his self-discipline, because he set very high standards for himself, and I think that came from a religious foundation.
Americans didn't always react favorably. A controversial interview with Playboy magazine threatened to derail his 1976 campaign, after Carter said that in his mind he committed adultery because he had lusted in his heart.
Well, the Playboy interview was a problem for the Carter campaign. I don't think it was a coincidence that his polls started to drop a little bit afterwards. And I think a lot of Americans weren't just used to talking about people talking that way. But if you grew up in evangelical circles, that was not a weird thing to say.
Carter used Christian themes of love, charity, and peace to shape his presidential agenda and the humanitarian work he became synonymous with.
He had a style of talking that that wasn't the kind of careful language that normal politicians would use.
In 1977, he returned the Panama Canal, stating fairness, not force, should lead international affairs.
Tonight I want to have an unpleasant talk with you about a problem that's unprecedented in our history.
And in an impassioned speech, compared the energy crisis to the moral equivalent of war.
I do think, compared to most politicians, he was pretty determined not to do a lot of the things that politicians did. And I think that came back to hurt him.
What God is telling us here is, when we experience grief, do what?
After his presidency, he returned to Plains and teaching Sunday school at Marantha. Some say Carter knew the Bible better than any president since Abraham Lincoln.
You don't see that much a lot of times in our politicians. And America has always been known for being a country of great values, and we've kind of gotten away from that.
In 2015, he shared with his congregation, and later the world, that cancer had been found in his liver and spread to his brain.
When he shared with our church that he had cancer before he told the whole world, I said this to him after he shared it. I said, I just want to tell you that God is not through with you, but we're going to fight this, and we're going to have the whole world pray for you. And God was not through with him.
Carter's religious example is part of his legacy.
I consider him someone who has imparted on me a lot of wisdom and love and grace, and something that I really appreciate and am thankful for. I'm reminded through his example that the man from Plains, who was raised in a town of 600 or 700 people, can still pursue peace and live out his Christian call wherever it takes you.
Wow. Pretty incredible. Unbelievable.
That's who he was.
And when she said that God is not done with him, and I'm thinking, God's still not done with him, because I think that those people, the young people that may not know about his legacy, are learning about his legacy, and they're learning about that faith, and that is going to continue on whether he is with us or not with us.
That's a great point, and I love seeing those images of him still teaching Sunday school and whatnot. What's so funny? I was just talking with a friend of mine recently about Sunday school, and I said, you know what? A lot of churches just don't have it like they used to.
Right.
I grew up in Sunday school, but now I can't tell you the last time I've been to
now
Sunday
they have small
school.
Groups,
the small group.
Now small groups meet outside of church.
It's the new stuff. Exactly. They're at the local Starbucks and whatnot. And things
right.
are just so different. But I love that even at his age and being in his 90s, he was still there standing before people behind that podium. And they were listening.
Yes.
They were listening to him. And people were coming from all over the country just to hear him speak in that capacity.
I wish I had done that. I was kicking myself really over the past 6 months, 7 months or whatever. And I was saying, dang, I should have gone, should have taken my girls over to Plains and been packed into that little Sunday school class to hear his message. It's interesting. when you talk about his faith and how honest he was, because he said he was never going to lie to the American people, eventually that ended up being kind of his downfall, because the truth of the matter is, how many people really want to know the truth, right? How many people really want to hear, well, you know what, maybe if you conserved energy, we wouldn't be in an energy crisis.
Right.
You know, it's kind of interesting, because Ronald Reagan kind of told people what they wanted to hear. He made us feel good about who we were. And we kind of wanted that coming out of Nixon. But then Carter started out okay, but I think when the energy crisis happened, I remember that because I was in high school at the time. Interest rates were through the roof. You know, he did a lot of good, and he was on the cutting edge of a lot of the things that we deal with today. But at that time, people didn't want to hear it.
And I'll say this, Gravir, I might have not been in high school at that time, but I can tell you this, you know, I watch a lot of shows that were from the 70s and the 80s, and Good Times being one of them. And I remember some of the references that they would have in there just about the economy in that state in the 70s and in the 80s. And now, when you put two and two together, you realize that that was the state that the country was in.
Correct.
There are a lot of people who were highly upset, and there were some who, you know, found it hard to support. But one thing that I believe most folks will be able to say is that he was honest. Some, you know, depending on how you look at him, it seems too honest, but he was honest. And if that was what he felt like he had to do, and if that's what he felt like he needed to do, given his faith, you know, you can only commend him for being true to himself.
Absolutely. And, you know, there's been so much criticism about his presidency in the past, because of the economy and oil prices and, you know, all those kinds of things. But when you realistically look back at his foreign policy and the Camp David Accords with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat shaking hands, and that image ever being, you know, indelible, really, in your mind.
Who thought that would happen?
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. And that's lasted all these years. And when you think about his human rights and being a champion for human rights and those things, he did a lot of good things during his presidency. They were just overshadowed by some of the other.
But it's good to know that he is being remembered. And on this day, you know, as we celebrate his life and remember the legacy that he leaves behind, he has made an impact for sure. And, you know, down there in Plains, Georgia, I can imagine there will likely be not just a lot of folks from the media down there, but a lot of people who are maybe visiting the town, seeing what it's about, seeing what it's been and what it will become now that former President Jimmy Carter is no longer there. And Atlanta News First, Sarah Hammond has been talking with people there, getting to know how they're feeling and really just getting some reaction that continues to pour in at this hour.
Been quiet this morning in Plains, but you know, businesses on Main Street here are starting to open up. There's no large scale memorial yet, but we did see a store owner placing white bows on the storefronts here on Main Street. And you know, I just talked to this man who tells me that, you know, President Carter was the first president he was able to vote for. And this man grew up about 15 miles outside of Plains, so he really said he felt such a kinship with President Carter. And so he had always said that when the day came that President Carter died, he wanted to be here in Plains, whether it meant just sitting on a bench, just being, you know, in the place where he grew up. And that's exactly where we found him, on a bench, just reminiscing about, you know, President Carter's legacy. And he told us that, you know, he actually met or saw President Carter twice. Once here when he was having lunch at one of the diners here. He saw all the Secret Service and saw President Carter walk in and shake the hands of everybody in there and greet everyone. And then he saw him again at an airport out west, the same thing. He saw him shake everyone's hand to greet them and say hello. So it just really drives home the point of how loved and respected President Carter is and was here in Plains. And, you know, you can't go very far here in Plains without seeing his name on a plaque or a building. You know, his childhood farm is just down the road from where we are. His campaign headquarters is right across the street from us in the old train depot. There's a sign here in downtown on Main Street that proudly states that Plains is home to Georgia's only president. And again, this man that I spoke to says, you know, he hopes one day again he'll get the chance to vote for a president from Georgia. But, you know, I know we've gone through his extensive legacy and resume here, but just to take it back, former President Jimmy Carter and his late wife, former First Lady Rosalind Carter, they are beloved here. He started as a peanut farmer here in Plains before his political career took him to the White House. He ran for state senate in the 60s, ran for governor. He lost the first time and he won in an easy victory in the 1970s. And then that's when he announced he would run for president, and he beat the incumbent Gerald R. Ford in a narrow margin, returned to Plains after one term, and he's been here ever since. So it's safe to say he is very beloved here in Plains, and his name and his legacy is here everywhere you look.
Absolutely, Sarah. And I understand you spoke with one man who I believe is a native of Plains, Georgia himself, and kind of speaks to the sentiment in the hometown of Jimmy Carter, how deeply he will be missed and how fondly he'll be remembered.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I think that's a sentiment that so many people share. And this man, he also spoke to the fact, and it's something, I'm from Georgia originally. I grew up in Macon. It's something I've heard all my life. And he echoed the sentiment of whether you agreed with President Carter politically. I've never heard someone, and he's never heard someone speak a cross word about President Carter as a person, as a man. And he says that that's something that, has echoed throughout everywhere he's been. People, say he was just such a respected man and a person with his humanitarian work and the legacy that, he left once he left office and started doing so much work with Habitat for Humanity and all the organizations that he was a part of. So that's definitely a sentiment shared on, like you guys have said, a somber day here in Plains.
Well, we know right now, Gavir, there are a lot of people wondering about the funeral plans and what's going to happen, because there will typically, when any president dies, there is a series of celebrations and of services to honor that life.
Absolutely. The last time we did this was for President Bush.
Yeah.
Right?
2018.
2018. Yeah. Yes, 2018. The big Mr. Bush.
Yes, that's right. H.W. Bush. Yes.
H.W. Bush. And now, of course, for former President Jimmy Carter, dead at the age of 100. We don't have all of the details worked out just yet. When I say we don't know all those plans just yet. The one thing we do know is that President Biden has declared January 9th a national day of mourning, and that there will be a state funeral for President Carter on the 9th. All of the other details are still being worked out, and as soon as that information is really formalized, of course, we'll be sharing that with you on the air. The one thing we certainly know is that he is going to be buried next to the love of his life, Rosalind Carter, his wife for 77 years, and they're going to be buried, he will be buried in Plains, right next to his wife, under a willow tree back behind their home that they built.
I mean, when you think about their love story and 70 plus years with one person.
A lot of PDA there.
And can I tell you?
I say that with love. And
yes, no. Can I tell you? I absolutely love that. I love that. It's funny because Gavir, you and I, we had a conversation and we were saying, you talk about some presidents and other presidents. Right. Again, it's not that they don't share a kiss as well, but you don't always see it. But we have a lot of images showing the two of them. There we go again. I love that. But that goes to show you truly who they were and what they meant to each other. And their love story is one that essentially wrote itself. You can't duplicate that. Mm-hmm. You cannot duplicate that. Again,
that picture right there.
Yes.
The one of them at
the Braves game.
He was a huge Braves fan, right? So they would always go to the Braves games, and invariably you would have the big jumbotron catch them.
And they love to do the kiss cam and all of that type of stuff.
The big kiss cam, he would sneak a smooch from the love of his life, Rosalind Carter. He said the best thing he ever did was marrying her. I had the opportunity ages ago. I did interview Mrs. Carter many years ago. I never got the opportunity to interview President Carter, but he wrote a book on marriage, and I took it down to the Carter Center and had him sign it for my mom and dad. And I treasure that these days now.
How cool is that?
They had a wonderful, wonderful relationship, but they were also really both very strong-willed. And he talks about that in the book. He talks about how there were some, fights because she had a very strong will and so did he.
But you know what? At the end of the day, They understood that they were one.
Correct.
And at the end of the day, they did what they had to do to get on one accord,
Yes.
which most that are able to be in marriage for that long will probably tell you that's the most important thing.
Right.
At the end of the day, you just got to get on the same page.
That's
Even
it,
if you got to
Rex.
go across the different lines and whatnot to get there. We talked about Mr. Carter loving baseball. He and Rosalind Carter definitely loving this. And, you know, he supported the Atlanta Braves since that team moved to Georgia in 1966. So when he was governor, Mr. Carter got to shake Hank Aaron's hand the day he broke the National League record for most home runs. And he actually threw the ceremonial pitch, the first pitch, in Game 6 of the World Series in 1995. And yes, that was the night that the Braves won the title. Was it because of Mr. Carter? I don't know.
Don't know, but the Braves shared this statement.
They sure did. So the Atlanta Braves saying that they are deeply saddened by the passing of President Jimmy Carter. They went on to say President Carter was a testament to the best America and Georgia can produce. He served both his country and home state with honor his entire life. While the world knew him as a remarkable humanitarian and peacemaker, we knew him as a dedicated Braves fan, and we will miss having him in the stands cheering on his Braves. They wanted to say our deepest condolences to his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren.
Should we talk more about his love story? Because I know Tracy Hutchins did a really nice job talking about that. This is Mr. Carter at Rosalind Carter's funeral. That was one of the last times that we saw him in public, and he was definitely frail, but he was right there in that front pew at her service. Because they had celebrated their 75th wedding anniversary, and then she died just a couple of years later.
Yep, so let's listen to this story.
The saying goes, behind every great man is a great woman. Always a step behind her husband, or more often, at Jimmy Carter's side, you would find Rosalind Carter. The couple grew up together in their small hometown of Plains, Georgia, but Rosalind didn't have a crush on Jimmy until she saw him in his naval uniform on a visit home from the academy.
I was standing on the steps of our church waiting for a youth meeting to begin. And he rode up in the car with Ruth and her boyfriend, got out and asked me to go to the movie with him. Well, of course, I left the meeting, I went to the movie. Don't ask me what it's about, I have not the slightest idea.
Well, I didn't have any idea what Rosa was going to say, but I think I came away fairly unscathed, and I'm grateful to you, sweetheart.
They kissed on that first date and married in that church in 1946, a union that would grow stronger over time and last for 73 years.
Hard work has been the driving force in Jimmy Carter's life.
After moving around the country on military assignment, the couple returned to run the family peanut farm in Plains, where they raised their 4 children. Carter was elected governor in 1970.
They're looking for a candidate they can trust. They see Jimmy and they respond to him. It's great.
6 years later, Mrs. Carter was front and center in her husband's run for the White House, campaigning alone on his behalf in 41 states. During their time as the first couple, Mrs. Carter supported her husband's work, something she did until his last day.
He's a good father, good grandfather, good great-grandfather, and I'm proud of him. I'm proud that he stands for human rights and peace all over the world.
For decades, the couple traveled the world, trying to change it for the better.
They truly live their life hoping to make somebody else's life better.
For better or for worse, their love never wavered.
An MRI showed that there was a cancer or growth, a tumor on my liver.
Shortly before announcing his cancer diagnosis, Carter published his book, A Full Life, Reflections at 90. Inside, a portrait he painted of his lifelong love, along with a dedication to her, to Rosalind, who has kept my life full of love.
Well, the best thing I ever did was marrying Rosalind. That's the pinnacle of my life. I think I've ever been as blessed as any human being in the world.
Now, what woman doesn't want some man to say that about her? Is that not the best?
Listen,
That
President
is the
Carter
best.
definitely putting us all to shame, making sure we understand how to treat our queens.
Yes.
And that he did. And you can just tell that he has nothing.
She was his partner, right,
She
Brooks? I mean, she
was.
was his partner in politics, and he really may not even have been where he was without her beside him.
And you know, thank you, because Tracy was just saying that, you know, we hear the quote of a woman being behind her
Right.
man, but she was right there alongside him, and that really shows you who they were and
Yes.
and how they worked together to create the change that they wanted to see, and they were committed to impacting lives and
Right.
serving people, and that's exactly what they did. So we want to take you out to the Carter Center, where we have seen a growing memorial there. Many people coming out, putting flowers down. Even somebody brought out a thing of peanuts, which we understand the sentiments behind that, given who President Carter was. But we've been seeing several people coming out there to the Carter Center today, and we can only imagine in the coming days that will likely be a growing memorial there.
Right. The Carter Center actually is separate from the Carter Museum and Library. You know, the museum and library has all the documents and, you know, the photos, and really it is exactly what that. It's a museum and library where people can go and look back on the legacy that he has left behind. But the Carter Center, Brooks, was something he and Mrs. Carter actually established, which sits right next to the Library and Museum, and they established the Carter Center in 1982.
So that was right when he was getting out of office.
Right.
Then he established that, and that seemed to be something that they were very passionate about. If you haven't had a chance to go out there and check that out, I would urge you to do so. I've, you know, one of the things about before living in Atlanta, there were all of these different things you had to do just when you would visit. So coming in as a visitor before calling this place home, that was one of the stops that we made with my family.
Oh,
and
that's
I just
cool. Yes.
loved absolutely all of those things that you get to see there, and how much you will learn there, again, about the major impact that he has made. One of the things we can tell you is that our Asia Wilson has been out there at the Carter Center today, again, you know, speaking with people, talking with people about how they're reacting to the news of former President Carter, who died yesterday at 100 years old, a lifelong lived, but a legacy that lives on forever.
What appeared to be a woman and a child, a small child, come up holding each other, embracing each other with flowers in hand, and then you can see them putting it down on the ground. But then you also see that small child kind of just take a picture. You can see the adult taking the picture in front of the sign of that child. So of course, you know, it's impacting not only people who were alive when he was president, but then also small children who are just hearing about this as well. So certainly this is impacting so many others. But also the woman that we spoke with earlier, she spoke about, you know, the president. And I asked her, what is one thing that you're going to remember most about President Jimmy Carter? And she said, his love for his wife, and just seeing them over the years. Me personally, I started out in Southwest Georgia, where I was in Plains. I was able to see him in person and just saw how loving he was, but also how he interacted not only with us, the media, but he actually took the time to shake people's hand, and that was something people admired in that community. But then also spent some time at the Boys and Girls Club in Southwest Georgia as well, and there he was, him and former First Lady were there front and center supporting some of those causes and some of those fundraisers. So he supported the children, he supported the Boys and Girls Club, Habitat for Humanity, and so many other things as well.
Yeah, Asia, of course, is there at the Carter Center, and as we mentioned, that was founded in 1982 by President Carter and First Lady Rosalind Carter, really in a partnership with Emory University. And the goal of the Carter Center is to advance peace and health across the world. It's helped improve the life for people in more than 80 countries, resolving conflicts, advancing democracy, human rights, economic opportunity, really preventing diseases, and mental health improvements as well. That was something that Mrs. Carter was really passionate about. And of course, in 2002, Jimmy Carter was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his decades, this I'm quoting now, for his decades of untiring effort to find peaceful solutions to international conflict, to advance democracy and human rights and to promote economic and social development. And you can see the President's Nobel Peace Prize at the Carter Presidential Library. Guess who the other Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to? Martin Luther King Jr.
Oh, well.
How about that?
Seems
So,
quite fitting.
Very fitting.
Two great men for sure. And today you may be wondering, how can I show the family, the Carter family, some support and some love in this time of bereavement for them? We do want to let you know that you can go to thecartercenter.org, where you will come to this page that you see here. This will allow you to make a donation if you choose to do so, to honor President and Mrs. Carter's legacy and ensure their vision continues to shape the world. The Carter Center has been a staple here in Atlanta for quite some time now, but as you said, Gravere, that this reach goes beyond the metro. It goes beyond Georgia. It's a global reach that they've been able to share with the world, and we believe that that will continue in the decades to come. But of course, support is needed to make things like that happen. So again, if you want to head over to cartercenter.org, you'll be able to make a donation to that fund, to the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter Enduring Hope Fund. And also, if you just want to leave some words of encouragement, some condolences that you may have, if you see it there at the top left-hand corner of this page, you can also find a link there where you'll be able to share your words and that the family will be able to receive those in their time of need.
And you make a really good point too, Brooks, because here we are, the local media, the national media, the international media, we're talking about his legacy, we're talking about his love story, we're talking about all the great things he did, and certainly those are amazing and remarkable things. But think of his family.
Yeah.
To his family, he was dad, he was granddad, he was great-granddad. And so certainly they are missing him on a deep and personal level today.
So those words, and if you've ever found yourself in a position, I've never had the pleasure of knowing someone to live 100 years old, but I've had a great-grandmother that lived to be 95.
Right.
And although they are, maybe to that point, and maybe you didn't expect them to live that long anyway, it is still, it'll hurt. It'll hurt. If nothing else, you understand they might have been at peace, but you just say, I'm going to miss them. Or you have those memories that you can recall. And you can imagine losing both Mr. and Mrs. Carter. That's a major part of that Carter family. So, remember, there are people who are mourning in that way. So that's why it'll be great if you could insert some condolences. I'm sure they would be glad to hear some of that from you.
He got that political start here, of course, in the state legislature. And we've got to talk about a local spot that, I don't know how many journalists actually go here anymore, but it used to be the spot for politicians and journalists, and that was Manuel's Tavern.
Yeah.
And Manuel's Tavern actually had a really special spot in President Carter's heart, and we visited to see what they thought about his legacy and what this loss means to them.
And it says, to my good friend Manny Maloof, Jimmy Carter.
Before he made it to the White House, James Earl Carter Jr., better known as Jimmy Carter, announced he'd run as Georgia's governor right here at Manuel's Tavern.
He just was really interlinked with us and with Manuel.
Manuel's Tavern started as a neighborhood bar in the 1950s, run by Manuel Maloof, known as the godfather of Georgia Democratic politics. The Carters would become regulars, especially after the Carter Center opened less than half a mile from the tavern.
He would come in and shake everyone's hand, and I have a photo of him with my daughter. When he saw my daughter, he stopped to spend extra time with her.
Journal manager Stephen Pitts says he'll miss seeing Jimmy's surprise patrons at trivia night, but is glad he's reunited with his wife, Rosalind Carter, who died a little over a year ago.
She was his true lifelong partner. They were so tight and so close.
And they'll never leave these historic walls.
All of his accomplishments, including maybe especially post-presidency, should make every Georgian proud.
Madeline Montgomery, Atlanta News First.
Yeah, if you get your picture on that wall, you've made it.
You've made it.
You've made it.
That seemed like that was the place. Gravere, what's so crazy is the Carters, we've been talking about the impact that they've made and the legacy that they're leaving behind, but also some of those new traditions. Let's take folks back to 1977 for the inaugural parade where the Carters decided to walk from the Capitol to the White House, becoming the first time a president ever walked the pavement of Pennsylvania Avenue after his inauguration, which actually defied the advice of the Secret Service.
Right.
But this started a new tradition, and it was continued by every president since then.
Yep, and there you see him, right? And I know
I love those old photos.
I know, isn't it great? I was actually in Washington working for President Obama's
Oh, wow. Okay.
inauguration, and oh boy, was it cold.
Oh,
my
I remember
gosh,
watching
it was
that.
So stinking cold. But watching President Obama and Michelle Obama walk that parade route, obviously I was too young to be at this inauguration.
But when you see that picture, it
but
takes
when you see
you.
that
Yeah.
picture, it takes you back to that, right? So
Yeah. And we talk about his legacy, and we talk about, again, the gift of being able to live 100 years on Earth.
right.
That is something. Not many people, as I stated this earlier, not many people can say they're able to do that. And even well into his 90s, he was still very present, still doing a lot of things at his church and whatnot. But again, he worked up until he couldn't.
He did.
He served up
and
until he couldn't.
That celebration was amazing.
Oh my gosh, yes.
That 100th birthday celebration, the musical lineup killed it. He was the rock and roll president?
He was the rock and roll
The
president.
Allman Brothers did a big benefit concert for him, which really helped put him in the White House, he thinks. And so everybody gathered at the Fox Theater for that huge 100th birthday celebration. I think you had to have an invite.
Yeah, I was going to say I tried to get on the guest list, but they nobody got back to me, unfortunately. But many were there.
My friend Rick Fulbaum actually sent me a link so I could watch it because I said, oh my gosh, Rick, the music, and don't you know he appreciated that.
So let's take you back to that 100th celebration.
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
A birthday party 100 years in the making, with a lifetime of friends all in one place to honor former President Jimmy Carter.
Such a great honor. We've been friends since the 70s, since he was governor.
Friends who've all been touched by President Carter's impact, including former UN Ambassador Andrew Young, who served in the Carter administration.
When I met him, I would have been happy to make 40. Now, I want to be like him and make 100.
Former Atlanta Braves star Dale Murphy told me about the first time he saw Carter in the stands and how loyal of a fan he was.
It was an extra special moment when you could look over before you got in that bat to see Jimmy Carter there.
Inside the iconic Fox Theater,
let us celebrate, and tomorrow and all the days that follow,
a hero salute and celebration with music that Carter loves.
Dreamers and their dreams.
From gospel, rock and roll, to jazz, even hip-hop.
We got a party right now, everyone.
Fitting for celebrating 100 years. His family says their grandfather was watching from his home in Plains.
He's doing okay. I mean, he's been in hospice for 19 months now, and so he's really physically diminished, but he's emotionally engaged, and he's still having these remarkable experiences in this world.
I'm Blair Miller, Atlanta News First.
Now, how cool is that? Isn't that cool?
And what was so cool is there were several genres that were present there at his 100th celebration. That means he had a good ear for music, a good taste in music.
Absolutely. I mentioned the Allman Brothers before we went to Blair's story there, and they were big fans of Jimmy Carter, and he was a big fan of theirs. And Chelsea Beimfohr talks a little bit more about that relationship.
Used that to his advantage when campaigning for president in the 1970s. Here at the Carter Center, you'll see references to him being nicknamed the rock and roll president. And about 80 miles south of here, there's another museum that honors a Georgia-based band that's credited with helping Carter win the White House. At the Allman Brothers Big House Museum in Macon, you'll find old memorabilia. Framed records, musical instruments, concert posters, and photos of Jimmy Carter.
I think people are unaware of their relationship with President Carter.
Then Georgia Governor Carter, like thousands of other Americans, was a fan of the Southern Rock and Roll Band in the 1970s, the same time period in which he was campaigning for president.
This is the poster from the Providence, Rhode Island show.
Richard Brent runs the Big House Museum and showed us this framed poster depicting a November 25th, 1975 benefit concert for Carter's campaign at the Providence, Rhode Island Civic Center.
His campaign was low on funds, and that particular show really gave him the resources that he needed to carry on. He recognized that there was an opportunity to gain some voters with, call it the hippie movement, I guess is a way to say it. But no, he just recognized there was an untapped resource right there.
The show raised thousands of dollars and likely thousands of new votes. Carter even sent the band a thank you note that's on display in Macon.
In this letter, he's basically saying my campaign is going very well, and we really expect to see good results.
Carter was elected president 1 year later.
You got this peanut farmer coming out of Plains, Georgia, who just ran on honesty and integrity, and that's what he offered, and it was just genuine, and that's what the country was looking for.
Carter continued his friendship with the band for decades, even receiving a degree from Mercer University with Greg Allman in 2016. Through the years, things changed and band members passed away, but the music and the memories never faded. And at 99 years old, Jimmy Carter is still known by many as the rock and roll president. Reporting from Macon, Chelsea Beimfor, Atlanta News First.
The rock and roll president.
I love that.
Gotta love that for sure. So we know he had great taste in music. We know that he was all about serving his community, but also something that you might have not known regarding his hobbies is that he liked to paint. That was one of his many passions, and he's done over 100 paintings he completed in his life, and he even got an interesting start in that hobby.
When a friend in the Navy lent him a Learn to Paint kit, a new hobby was born for Jimmy Carter. It predates his career in politics and has lasted long after it, too.
President Carter's done 108 paintings in his lifetime.
From still lifes to landscapes, and his favorite subject, birds. Carter Center CEO Paige Alexander says the 39th president had quite the knack for painting. This painting of a bald eagle, the symbol of the nation, sold this weekend for $225,000 at auction, all to raise money for the Carter Center.
And so to be able to auction that off and have a piece of memorabilia of something that President Carter really focused on as he was painting it was really special.
The auction list included other big-ticket items, too. $20,000 for a guitar signed by Eagles frontman Don Henley, and $500,000 for a collection of poetry featuring works by the Dalai Lama, Maya Angelou, and Bob Dylan. But the 2013 Carter oil painting is a unique work done by one of George's favorite sons. It's more significant with recent news of Carter and his wife Rosalind's failing health.
This bald eagle in particular, it represents so much in his life, but it also represents his passion for enjoying nature and seeing the beauty in everything.
Doug Reardon, Atlanta News First.
That's pretty remarkable. I wonder too, that being a president, obviously high-stress job.
Of course.
A lot of stress in being in the public eye, and maybe painting was an outlet for him too.
Yeah,
right?
Some of us know better than to try to paint because it won't always go well. But if you look at some of his work, it is kind of impressive.
Pretty cool.
I like that. How cool is that? Well, we know, again, that reaction has been pouring in. But yesterday when that news first came down, the nation was looking to hear from President Joe Biden, and he did speak of here.
This is a sad day, but it brings back an incredible amount of good memories. Today, America and the world, in my view, lost a remarkable leader. He was a statesman and humanitarian. And Jill and I lost a dear friend. I've been hanging out with Jimmy Carter for over 50 years, it dawned on me. And I had countless conversations over those years. And I always would be proud to say that he used to kid me about it, that I was the first national figure to endorse him in 1976 when he ran for president. There was an overwhelming reason for it, his character. What I find extraordinary about Jimmy Carter, though, is that millions of people all around the world, all over the world, feel they lost a friend as well, even though they never met him. And that's because Jimmy Carter lived a life measured not by words, but by his deeds. Just look at his life. was life's work. He worked to eradicate disease not just at home, but around the world. He forged peace, advanced civil rights, human rights, promoted free and fair elections around the world. He built housing for the homeless with his own hands. And his compassion and moral clarity lifted people up and changed lives and saved lives all over the globe. Jimmy Carter was just as courageous in his battle against cancer as he was in everything in his life. Cancer was a common bond between our two families, as of many other families. And our son Bo died. When he died, Jimmy and Rosalind were there to help us heal. Jimmy knew the ravages of the disease too well. He lost his father, his brother, his sisters to this terrible disease. So when Jimmy was diagnosed, we did our best to comfort him. We met with him down in Plains. We met with him, and anyway. We talked and shared our beliefs that as a nation, we have the talent. We have the talent and the resources to one day end cancer as we know it, if we make the investments. He believed that like I do. I'll always cherish having seen Jimmy and Rosalind Carter together. Theirs was a love affair of the ages. While I will miss them both dearly, I do take some solace in our kids were saying it, that they're united once again. We're going to remain forever in our hearts, but they're together again. The entire Carter family, on behalf of the world, the whole nation, we send our whole heartfelt sympathies and gratitude. Our gratitude for sharing President Carter with us for so many years. You know, Jimmy Carter stands as a model of what it means to live a life of meaning and purpose, a life of principle, faith, and humility. His life dedicated to others.
That is President Biden addressing the nation on the death of Jimmy Carter and speaking not only as a president, but someone who had a long relationship with him. In 1978, Jimmy Carter boarded Marine One at the White House, flew to Wilmington, Delaware to do what? To raise money for one of his first national political allies, the state's 35-year-old first-term senator, Joe Biden. And President Biden will be eulogizing President Carter next week at the Washington National Cathedral.
So we do know that January 9th will be declared a national day of mourning for the entire country. And President Biden is asking for people in their respective places and in their respective places of worship just to remember, honor the life and legacy. And that is what I believe a lot of people are going to be doing in the coming days. We know that President Carter was a man of faith. President Carter was a man of service, and that is how he is being remembered. So the news continues always on AtlantaNewsFirst.com, and we are about to reset and get you to our Atlanta News First newscast at noon, and then we'll be right back here on Atlanta News First Plus. Make it a great Monday.